We have Yolanda Barnes, who's head of residential research at Savills. So she's done sort of over 20 years there, it says on the website. I'm not going to use the exact number, don't worry. So she's well versed in all these residential issues. And we also have Chris Bolton, who's chief executive of a company called You, which is an interior design firm which works on hotel and residential schemes. And it's done schemes in sort of 5 continents around the world, about 27 countries, as I understand it. So he's also well versed in trying to fit lots of people into small spaces, only in a professional capacity, I should add. We're going to do 2 5-minute talks from Yolanda and Chris, and then we'll have a Q&A session. So if you do have any questions, then sort of make a note of them. Then we'll sort of come to the audience after that. So to start with, we'll have Yolanda.
Great. I thought I'd stand over here so you've got something different to look at for the next half hour. Please forgive me, I've got a streaming cold, so I hope you can decipher my language through all the cold. But what I wanted to do today was say something a bit more about the context in which apartments are being designed, rather than the actual design of apartments. There are people here far more qualified than I to talk about building design and interiors. What I want to do, though, is set the context very much from the point of view that I come from every day, which is that of housing markets, and increasingly thinking in terms of world cities and how they work. And I want to talk about housing markets because, of course, any piece of design only takes place in the context of those markets. And before we get hooked on the 4 walls and the roof of the apartment, I want to broaden out the context of those apartments in cities. And we've just heard about the immense urbanisation that's occurring in cities. Now we look at what we call New World cities as well as Old World cities right across the globe. There is a distinct difference between the New World, where a lot of young people are migrating in from the countryside to these global cities that are being built at a rate that would make your eyes water. I had to double check my figures, but enough residential floor space was built in China last year for 25 million apartments, which just makes our 150,000 units a year pale into complete insignificance in this country. So there's city building at a scale that we can barely comprehend going on in one half of the world. But I'm going to rather concentrate on what we call the old world, which includes cities like New York and Tokyo and, of course, London. And I will sort of talk very much in the context of London because that's where we are. And I think the pressures facing old world cities are much more, are different and arguably more complex because we have a lot more already developed land. Our cities are already full, if you like. We don't have the option, as Shanghai do, to designate green fields for miles beyond the centre as part of the city. And I want to just highlight a thought about 3 things that comprise housing production. There's one thing that we all concentrate on a great deal, which I call product. That is the actual residential property units. What I think, though, we ignore are 2 other very, very important elements of housing delivery, and that is land and money. And those 2 interact with the product itself to change it potentially out of all recognition. And it is that environment, the environment of land and money, that designers have to design the product into. I've argued for quite a while now that London is not limited in terms of its growth, its physical growth, so much by its green belt as by its suburban belt. We were arguably the first city to build suburbs. Metroland first happened in London. And certainly since the 1930s, that ring of owner-occupied individual tracts of land that comprise our suburbs are limiting London's growth, I would argue, just as surely as any planning policies about Greenbelt, perhaps in some ways more effectively, because individual land ownerships are very, very difficult to redevelop into urbia. So going from the suburban to the urban. And that is the way over centuries past cities have actually developed. The densification and intensification of use has occurred in the suburbs, and you can see that, Chelsea was once a little village in the middle of green fields, certainly no longer. So we've got a situation where I would argue not understanding the basic land economics of our cities. And that old thing that you may remember from geography at secondary school, that bid rent and the highest rents, the highest land values being in the centre and gradually falling away. What we've got is a very, very pressurised centre in London with extraordinarily high values, land values, where only the very wealthiest can afford to compete. And we've got actually vast tracts of suburbia, which is becoming increasingly obsolete. It was designed for households nearly 100 years ago, not necessarily for modern households. And while London is experiencing some of those population pressures that you see in the New World cities, that is the influx of young people, indeed young people from all over the world, not just surrounding the surrounding country, it is also seeing much more complex demographic shifts as the population ages. So we're getting changing demand from the very wealthy in the centre, for example, but also the potential for downsizing families. The way we've also seeing sort of as empty nesters come back into the city from the countryside, so older people. We're also seeing a tendency in London for families to stay put in London. So it seems to me that all these forces and factors are working together to create a very complex and deep and varied demand for housing, of which undoubtedly what we call rather provocatively shoebox living or shoebox apartments is one, for those young people who are probably not at home terribly much and don't really know how to use a kitchen, let alone want to use it very often. So there's everything from that right through to the family houses. So what I'm going to be arguing is that actually our design solutions, when it comes to designing the right apartments, actually go very, very much wider than the right apartments. We're talking about designing for the right market, that is designing for the money and getting things financed and paying attention to land values, land constraints, and how we use cheaper land to its most efficient level, effectively how we urbanize the suburbs. And in order to do that, we have to think at street level. We have to think about how blocks of apartments or houses or small units separated into apartments, indeed units that may be completely flexible and capable of being used for either family houses or a mix of non-residential use, all the things that the space that serves us for all the things that we don't do in the home. How we accommodate all those things and create the urban out of the less than urban land that is actually available. I think that's the real challenge of city building, and it goes way beyond how we look at the inside of four walls and a ceiling. Thank you.
That's great, thank you. And now we'll have Chris's presentation.
Well, Thank you, Richard. Thanks, Yolanda. And well, I'm not a designer, but I do run a business that does a lot of design. And what I thought was useful to do today was just run you through some of the work we've looked at that's influenced us in how we approach the issue of how you sort of get people living in confined spaces. I think it's obviously useful to look at some statistics. Obviously, London's been talked about by Yolanda, but look at the population increasing from 7.3 to 8.2 million in the last 10 years. If you look at the UK provincially, obviously a lot of growth in the provincial cities in the UK. And of course we hear a lot globally about cities growing as well, particularly in countries like China and India. And we've heard about the sheer explosion in growth in the Chinese marketplace. So looking at micro apartments, a lot is discussed about this, and it's something we've spent a long time as a business designing homes for people around the world looking at. And clearly in some markets micro apartments are the solution. They don't suit all, of course. They might suit the very young, they might suit the very old, the empty nesters, all that sort of person, but fundamentally they don't suit everybody. If you look at London, actually, looking at the statistics we've looked at, we have some of the smallest apartments in the world here already. Our standards here are one thing, but also we're driving down the sort of size, and that's probably, as I come on to talk about, is probably more driven by perhaps developer profit than the needs of the actual user. And one of the statistics I thought was very interesting is the size of an apartment often in London is 46 square metres, which is the size of a Jubilee carriage. Now, most of you will have come here today, I guess, partly on Jubilee line, partly on DLR. So just think of that Jubilee carriage, and that's the size of an apartment. We were discussing it in the office, and we thought actually living perhaps in small spaces is in our genes, actually, because perhaps we all started off in the caves, some sort of nationalities, some sort of cultures, obviously in teepees and yurts and the like. And it was also interesting looking at the Edwardians, and they were building 3-bed flats in the Edwardian times of 120 square metres, where now we're creating 4-bed homes in 100 square metres. So perhaps this is in our genes. We started off perhaps living in small spaces, and we're going back that way now. So perhaps driven by our own sort of needs as well as the economics of it. In terms of global solutions, there's lots of information on the web about this in terms of what's happening in major cities. Mayor Bloomberg, of course, very famously, in terms of his design competition, looking at micro apartments in a city which is well known to need sort of compact spaces for its inhabitants, but also places in the US like San Francisco and Vancouver too, and inevitably in the Far East in places like Don Juan, Hiroshima, and also in Eastern Europe in the context of Warsaw. And of course then the business of micro, as I said, sometimes you can be a bit cynical about this and perhaps say, well, it is driven more about developer profit than the actual needs of people, and I'll come on to talk about that, as I said. Because realistically, if you're looking at saving a square foot in a building, you can save, £150 per square foot in terms of build cost. Now, I'll let you do the maths in terms of how that can sort of impact on profit or what you can pay for the land. Coming to some examples, then there are examples, of course, in London. You can see where compact spaces have worked, and I think one of the leading sectors for how people work in compact senses and the best use of perhaps land in urban areas is student apartments. Of course, we know that many student university college campuses are in urban areas, and therefore there's a great need to really be efficient in how you use the space. And NIDA, of course, was, I think, a market leader in that in King's Cross, in units there starting at 13 square metres and renting for £300 a week. So very, very profitable as well, and very, very efficient. And of course, it was a few years ago now, but I think most people will probably remember the Knightsbridge broom cupboard that was reportedly sold or went on the market for £200,000. It was 9 square metres, and I think the biggest selling feature there was the fact it was just down the road on Brompton Road from Harrods. But it worked as a home, if you could really fancy living in something that small, of course. And I think also houses have become more sort of condensed over time as well. My own professional institution, Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, back in 2005 did a study looking at how homes, particularly in the London or the UK market, have become more condensed. Remember what I said about the Edwardians with their 3-bed apartment, and now you can get less space for a 4-bed home. So it's nothing new. And of course the RIBA now has its HomeWise campaign as well, which is looking at how suitable homes are for people, particularly in that sort of UK context. because what they've identified clearly is people need space and light in which to live. And as I said at the outset, it doesn't necessarily work for all. And obviously in terms of new build developments, they are getting more condensed. And if you look at sort of space standards in London, then the London, I believe, is the only city, certainly in the UK, to have sort of space standards. And the recommendation is, 50 square metres, when the new build reality is the 46 square metres. Remember that as you go home this evening back towards the west, if you're going that way, remember that sort of size of the Jubilee carriage. There are many solutions and many things we've been involved in working with other companies looking at how you use space very effectively, and one was the Yo home solution. Now I think most of you know Yo from Yo Sushi and Yotel, but also they developed this that was launched at 100% Design just about a year ago actually, and this was an 800 square foot space, so actually quite large in the context of some of the micro apartments people are talking about, but it used mechanics, so the bed actually raises up into the ceiling, you get tables coming out of the floor, so very, very funky, very, very quirky. And it's using actually technology from the West End stage, basically, in terms of how you move scenery around and bringing that into the sort of housing environment. And we've done a bit of work with this with Simon Woodruff, the launch of the founder of Yo Sushi and Yo Home, to see how we can even make it smaller, actually, and make it work, because you don't have to have necessarily a double bed and whatever. There's various things you can do, and there's a great way you can do this, of course, of putting it into existing buildings as well, so bringing redundant buildings back into use, which is again a major factor of London with the sort of offices to residential. One of the issues created by this though is you do need quite a significant floor to ceiling height. You need slab to slab 3 metres, so that does often restrict you in old buildings in terms of achieving that, but it's a solution. It's using that sort of thing that's flexible. So, you know, you can have it as a sort of one-bed apartment maps during the week. During the weekend, you can move things around and make enough room for a family to live in there, for instance. Another example is a couple of Dutch guys called Hotels Ahead have developed a concept called Zoku. And they're working very hard at the moment on a building in central Amsterdam and also one here in Shoreditch in London, which is this micro-apartment idea where it actually has a mezzanine level. So you've got everything going on in terms of the bathroom, the kitchen, the sort of living and eating area down at the ground floor level, then you've got a sort of mezzanine layer where people will live above that. And I think that's very interesting as well. That concept actually came again really from sort of student housing to hotels and then into real residential space, based on the fact as well that many people when they travel are probably travelling on projects, so hotel bedrooms don't actually work for them particularly well. So they want to sort of be in a space that works more of a home. So that's interesting how it's sort of germinated there, has now been taken into something that potentially could be somebody's home. The London solution, I think many cities solution, but perhaps, you know, I'll leave this as a thought and perhaps something to debate later. Perhaps part of the London solution, we've heard about the urban and suburban and all those sort of things going on, is to go higher, of course, in terms of more efficient use of land, the sort of thing we call very much the vertical village, and many of the buildings we're involved in around the world are certainly in the vertical plane, certainly not the horizontal one, and that is one way of dealing with it. One of the things I thought I couldn't leave today, though, without talking about the sort of micro apartments, is that clearly you might give people very compact places in which to live. That might work for them, but you've got to create the community as well. That's one thing that can often be lacking in major city centres around the world. So we see a very important factor as a sort of designer and focused in terms of getting involved in developing buildings is creating these communal areas where people can have a shared experience, even if they are living in something very, very small, when they actually go behind their front door. One amusing thing I thought was also very funny, one thing we picked up on the web, is you can actually hire this place for €1 a night. There's a 1 square metre home in Berlin, and fascinating, 2 people in it here. So to lie down and you have to lie on your side and sort of get into the sort of fetal position, which of course is familiar to us all from the very early beginnings, but oh, that was quite fun. Perhaps not the solution we're sort of going to be looking at. And I think back to this HomeWise campaign, I think it is a very worthy campaign, and Richard put me onto it a week ago because I hadn't been involved in it, but looking at that, it's all about joining various people and saying, telling the world we can't live without space and light. And I think you have got some challenges there. If you're creating tight spaces because you haven't got the space in which to develop, you've still got to create something which is habitable, does have light, and does give people some space in which to sort of live. And perhaps, as again I said a minute ago, one of the solutions for that is creating communal areas, so your space behind your front door is very restricted, but you have got a communal area in the building as well. But often the economics of that don't always work. So that was a very quick canter through. I hope you found that useful in terms of seeing some of the applications of micro apartments around the world, and we'll open it up to a debate, I guess.
That's great. Thank you, Chris. We now have 25 minutes for Q&A. So if you have any questions, put your hand up. I think there's roving mics, so you'll be able to be heard. But I'll kick off, if I may. One of the things that struck me when I was looking at this, obviously London has a big issue with housing affordability. Do these micro apartments sort of offer any sort of solution to that? Are they much cheaper than other places that people might be able to buy?
Yeah, I think in any city. Are we on? Yeah, we're on. I think in any city, if you've compressed the space you're in, you're sort of taking less square footage. So ergo, it should be cheaper. And certainly that was the idea behind the home solution, is that you were creating a smaller space overall in which someone could live, and then making it very flexible. So your bedroom became your living room became your dining room, and so on and so forth. You just didn't need to have that space take. So therefore, it has to be cheaper.
That's good. This is working. I think to add to that, I'm very concerned. We discovered when we published our international comparison of small apartments called Shoebox Living, at just how much emotion that publication aroused. And I think there's a real danger in confining a discussion like this to small apartments, in suggesting that this is a single solution. And I think one thing I notice about the housing market, everybody's looking for that silver bullet, the single solution, the thing that will solve all the housing problems. Small apartments in and of themselves, by themselves, are not going to solve the problem, but I think they are a very, very important part of the solution, because what they do is present choice. And I think London's a really interesting city because it actually has a great deal more choice in terms of price points, locations, and sizes of property and types of property than most world cities do. And this is something I think we don't talk about a great deal in London. We concentrate on just how expensive the centre is. But actually, I think the most important thing about the provision of small shoebox apartments or micro apartments, whatever you want to call them, is that they present a choice. They actually give somebody the choice of either commuting for an hour or more from the suburbs, or for the same price, trading in space for a lower commute and what might be considered a more convenient lifestyle. So it's playing off those land values in order to provide choice. And I'm not going to tell anybody which choice they should make, but I'm very clear that we should be providing the choice.
I guess the thing that I struggle with is whether young people would necessarily buy these places, because they don't to me seem to offer you that potential to kind of hook up with someone and have a kid and start a family. I'm concerned they have such a kind of a very narrow appeal. Do you think that's a problem? Do they only appeal to kind of young people who will sort of stay in them for 4 or 5 years and then kind of move out somewhere else?
Well, just an observation, the ones I've seen actually probably offer much better chances of meeting somebody than the suburbs do, because the best designed micro homes will have that amenity space, that shared amenity space, and certainly a lot of what I've seen does. And we all know how student accommodation facilitates the meeting up of partners or friends or whatever. So I think I'm way past that stage now, but I think you'd stand a better chance in one of these places than the standard suburbia, for example.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Clearly, if you're out at night in central London, then you've got to travel an hour to go back. You're going to leave to go back earlier, aren't you? Where if you're in town, then it's an easy walk home. And I think that's it. I think these places, depending how they're designed, suit people in different phases of life. And I think that's one of the key things in terms of homes, isn't it? What we need at 18 to 24 is very different to what we need from sort of 40 to 50, and what we need at 78 to to when we sort of pass away. It is different, and I think it's that sort of flexibility you need, and I think they are providing a solution, particularly as I said. I think the student housing sort of applications have provided a very good solution for that market in urban areas. It's what students need. It's close on to campus. It works. Doesn't mean to say it works when those students actually get their first job and then want to sort of move on and have a family and whatever. So I think they serve that need in sort of an area. I think, if you look at the sort of Bloomberg initiative in New York, I think it's the sheer scale of people that they need to accommodate there, in terms of sort of low wage workers, in sort of various industries, particularly restaurant industry in New York and whatever. You've got to accommodate them close to the centre. They work ridiculously long hours. They don't want to have to commute for an hour or so at the end of the day, in what could be a sort of dangerous sort of neighbourhood. So actually trying to get them into the centre in Manhattan is very, very powerful.
Great, thank you for your answers there. Do we have any questions from the audience, or should I get stuck into another issue? I'll take that as I should get stuck into another issue. There's quite an interesting statistic I heard in the preceding session about sort of currently 1 in 6 people sort of in the UK is over 65. But I think by 2050 that's due to be 1 in 4. I mean, do you think that these apartments offer sort of a solution for people at the other end of life? Maybe their sort of partner's died, or they're downsizing, or whatever, and they kind of need to find somewhere. Do they offer a solution, or are they sort of?
I think that's a really interesting question, and one that I was going to bring up. I mean, I mentioned the empty nester sort of issue, and undoubtedly there's a huge problem in this country that it is very difficult to actually downsize and release enough equity to make the whole downsizing in older age worthwhile. Now, that's a real bind to the housing market, because it ties up large houses occupied, or some would say under-occupied, by elderly people for much longer than would otherwise be the case. Whether micro apartments actually provide the downsizing product, I'm not entirely sure. I think it might do in the case of people who want to be perhaps based in the UK or in the city for some of the time, but not all of the time. But one observation I make with some feeling, certainly when looking at my parents' house, is just how much stuff we managed to accumulate between that 18 to 24 period and older age. And I think micro apartments are great for students, great for young sort of graduates and young workers. I'm not sure that they simply have enough space for all our stuff as we downsize in late middle age and old age.
I think that's a good point, actually, Yolanda. I think, if you look at the RIBA HomeWise initiative, one of the things they've identified is people saying in micro apartments, small spaces, there's not enough room for their possessions. And that presents a real challenge. You end up putting it in sort of self-storage somewhere, then you haven't got access to it. So, and as you get older, of course, you do accumulate lots of things, and it becomes hard to get rid of it. I think, however, if you start looking at micro apartments for the old, the aged, and those that sort of need assistance, actually then sort of reducing the sort of real estate they're in might work well, because obviously then they are releasing, the bigger homes, and as their need for care goes up, bearing in mind, when you get to that sort of age, the curve of how much care you're going to need going forward is going to be significant. You need to release equity to be able to fund that. That's one of the challenges many people are facing today, and therefore perhaps it is a way to go, if you actually condense the amount of space you need. I think the problem is it's people's well-being as well. You've got to ensure you do create something that's actually still pleasant to live in. And if you go to most retirement homes in the UK, and I've been around a few, in a professional and a personal capacity, if you look at where people often start off in there, they do start off in 2-3 bed units, because the expectation is they'll have the family to stay. When they sort of decline a little bit more, they're down perhaps to a sort of 2-bedder or 1-bedder, and then when they go into the sort of dependent end of it, where all the services are provided, food and healthcare and all that, then they're down to a 1-bed, little more than a hotel or a hospital room, really. That's it. It already exists. It just didn't perhaps exist in the true commercial centre in urban areas, and nobody's really got their heads around that.
Yeah. I mean, it does make sense to sort of try and accommodate these sort of older people in these apartments if possible. Just because I've seen some research about the sort of the health benefits for older people of being in city centres, because they are closer to health provision. They're sort of in buildings with other people who can sort of monitor or say, oh, it's not quite right. I haven't seen them out recently. Maybe we should go and check. I mean, you can see sort of a benefit for trying to sort of make these homes sort of work for those people.
I think that's a really key point, and it comes back to the point I was making earlier about the importance of the urban. I don't think, I mean, there are very few housing types that really work for people, certainly in youth and old age in particular, that are as isolated as some of the developments that we've been making over the last half century or so. And it seems to me that the size of apartment or living space matters less if you have access to other amenities or even a view of a real street. I went to see some elderly housing in the Netherlands, and they have a very different attitude to, it seems, to provision there, where a lot of it's on street, very much in real places, and that seems to make a huge difference to outcomes. Whereas putting a lot of elderly people in a lot of small units in the middle of nowhere would work in an entirely different way, I think. So I come back to this thing about designing the box in the context of place. Lifetime neighbourhoods, if you like, rather than lifetime homes.
I think it's back to creating the communities which I touched upon. You know, if you're putting people in very small spaces within a large development in an urban area, then it's creating some sort of communal space for there to be a community. You know, we all thrive on communities, no matter where we happen to live. We yearn for that. You know, even when we lived in caves, there were communities, you know, and I think that's a very important factor of it. And I think, you know, young or old, I think, you know, for the reasons we're giving, whether you're a student, whether you're a pensioner, you know, again, being in an urban area with access to all the facilities is very, very important. You know, perhaps where micro apartments and small living doesn't work is when you are sort of growing as a family, when you're getting married or getting a partner, and then sort of having kids and growing the family.
Okay. We have about 10 minutes left if anyone has any questions. Yes. Madam.
In the design of the micro apartments, do they have the flexibility of joining two together to give a life cycle to they are micro, but could they be joined?
Yeah, certainly in the Zoku solution, that's been one of the things that's looked at, as you can combine multiple units. And I think also then the configuration of buildings you're trying to put them in, you end up with corner units, which naturally, a bit like hotels, you know, you end up with a sort of corner that's difficult to utilise, so it ends up being a bigger room or two adjoining rooms. So yeah, there's always that ability too.
Yes, just at the risk of... I'm always nervous about mentioning this, but of course, some of the building blocks and the building blocks of cities that you find most often right across the world, you can find them from Shanghai to Amsterdam to South America, you find city houses, the building blocks of streets that we barely notice. We just take it for granted. That is street, that is city. You'll actually find that they're incredibly flexible too. If you look, for example, at Inigo Jones' house in Covent Garden, you'll find it's been used for just about every use under the sun. All sorts of residential, probably a few brothels as well, and as well as warehouses, storehouses, shops, offices, the whole lot. And this sort of bigger scale building, allowing for flexibility and this possibility of not effectively knocking things together, separating them again over people's lifestyles, over different changing economic conditions. It's an incredibly important building block of city.
I think also what is really important is the height, which gives the flexibility, because once, you know, you usually now have a 2.4, as if you go to Meadowvale or, you know, other part of London, you have a 3 meters or 3.5, which gives you one big room but double space.
Yeah, I've been trying actually to persuade my estate agent colleagues to measure cubic footage instead of
exactly.
Square footage.
That's what's important, is the cubic.
I'm surprised they haven't done that, Yolanda, in terms of actually higher prices. But yeah, I think one of the challenges both for Your Home, I think I mentioned actually, and also the Zoku thing, is you do need, if you're putting them into existing buildings, you do need that sort of at least 3 metres slab to slab. Because obviously with 3 metres, yeah, and that's presented quite a significant challenge in them looking for buildings that suit. And I have to say, a lot of developers aren't particularly keen with looking at a sort of greater slab to slab, because again of the cost of going up, the incremental sort of cost of doing that is not always that attractive.
That's great, thank you. I can see the batons passed. So if you can still remember your question, then
I think I can.
then go for it.
I'm sometimes, once people are moving out of the micro apartments onto the next stage, I'm sometimes a little scandalised by the size of bedrooms and rooms available for people for living, especially families going into this. When are we going to see HomeWise begin to change the mind of developers to provide homes that are really workable on a long-term basis for people?
Well, that's a good question, one I'll probably struggle to answer. When are they going to make that change? Well, I think the developers would argue that they're creating something, they do a lot of market research and understand their market. And I think, any developer today that doesn't, I think is making a grave mistake. But we're talking really about that sort of transition to the next stage up, the sort of the bigger homes. And I think sometimes they can go over the top, perhaps, in sort of room sizing. But I think generally, I'm not convinced that's the case. I mean, if you look at, I was quite interested by that statistic someone told me about, the Edwardians building a 3-bed apartment in 130 square metres, now 4-bed houses in 100 square metres. So I think, which is contra to, perhaps the suggestion we're making that they're bigger and perhaps wasteful. But I think, at the end of the day, is that I really do believe that they're looking at what their consumer or customer needs. I think, in micro apartments, then I think, again, we're still at the early stages of it, although there's lots of examples of it being seen, whether it's Nido, whether it's what Zoka are doing in the Your Home thing. I think we're still very early stages, and it really is a matter of connecting with what the consumer wants. And I think the HomeWise campaign, I think that's why I think it's very useful in that. And I think, I'd urge people to get involved in that debate, because it's only by doing that people will really find what the consumer wants.
And that campaign is sort of lobbying for sort of minimum space and light standards in new homes as well. So potentially regulation might be one way to ensure they build bigger homes.
Maybe I could just try and put this in context. I would suggest that most people who move on from that studio or one-bedroom apartment do not go into new homes. A vast majority of first-time buyers, if you like, or second steppers, will be going into a Victorian terraced house, probably, the ubiquitous 3-bedroom terraced house. And I think we keep forgetting that new build of any sort is about 0.4% of stock in any one year. You're talking about a tiny, tiny increment to second-hand stock, which is the market. And I would argue that most new build property is actually a niche market, and a very, very precise niche. It is a niche of people who will buy new build homes of a certain size and specification and standard. And the entire UK house building industry is more than occupied and actually currently very profitable, building just to that niche. If you really are going to start creating competition, you would first of all have to massively increase the output. So the Chinese are building 2 houses per household every 100 years. We're building at a tenth of that rate. So the average house has to last a good deal longer than that. And I think we come back to this issue of land, money and product. I think at the moment we have extraordinarily limited range of product. Unless we start thinking much more radically about how we release land, for example, to self-builders, or what I prefer to call build-to-own, that is self-procurers, for example, at the rate they do just over the pond, just in Europe. It's about 50% of all output is built by people for themselves.
Now that's where you start getting space standards working, because then people build the size and shape and will make the trade-offs between land cost or space cost and build cost and size much more efficiently. And I think until we have that diverse range, that increased volume, more diverse range of routes to market, if you like, and much greater competition both with the second-hand stock and the speculative house builders, I don't see things changing other than by regulation.
Okay, we've maybe got time for sort of one or two more questions. So, is that gentleman there?
Yeah, by encouraging the micro house or or shoebox houses within the cities, don't you drive out the families? Because wouldn't it be better to put or look at lifetime homes? Because cities are made up of various people, age groups of people, and you're purely by encouraging the shoebox house, you're bringing it down to young people, students, a young age group, and you're losing the family element.
Well, I think it's a complete mistake to think that product drives demand. If all you build is family homes, you do not, by any measure, guarantee that you will only get families living in them. What you get, if you don't have that ridiculous broom cupboard in Knightsbridge, is you get somebody who can afford £250,000 buying a bigger home instead and driving out the people who need the bigger place, when all they need it for is perhaps changing or an overnight stay once in a while. So actually, I would say if you provide the variety and the choice, you're actually more likely to accommodate the families, because you're taking up the people who need less space have the choice of taking up less space, basically. So I don't think that by building supply of a certain type, most 3-bedroom houses are not in this country are not occupied by families with children. The families with children are in a minority, and so the product does not govern the demand. The demand governs the demand. The issue is changing the supply to meet the demand.
Well, I understand what you're saying, but I think you'd have to regulate the amount of shoebox houses within a certain area, because then you would change the market, wouldn't you?
Yes, I'm not suggesting it's a single solution and should be a ubiquitous solution across the whole of the centre. It's got to be viewed as one of the options that are needed. And, we do actually regulate the number of family houses by the use of the affordable housing quotas in Section 106, which are by and large for families.
Actually, I've got a question. Obviously, the May Design series is a design show. What do you think that micro apartments offer sort of a lot of opportunities for sort of design firms, whether it's sort of making smarter beds that fold out of walls or smaller chairs or whatever? Do you think that there are opportunities there for the people in this room?
Yeah, of course there are. I think that's one of the things, a lot of this stuff that I've shown today is work that's been done by our design team, where we've been approached by developers all over the world just looking at different solutions, where it's not all sort of high-end stuff, which is a lot of what we get involved in big apartments, big homes, but it's looking at sort of a more efficient use of space, where it is in sort of cities in China and cities in India, for instance. So I think it gives that chance to innovate and look at new solutions and apply things you learn in other areas, whether it's aircraft cabins or boat cabins or trailers, how people live in small spaces. A lot of it's come from that. And I think, again, sort of the Yo-Home inspiration there of, using stage sort of management material from the West End stage, basically, how you move stage scenery around as, the hydraulics and all that sort of stuff that's used to get the bed to go up into the ceiling. So it gives a great opportunity, I think, for designers to look at real solutions. And our involvement in the Zoku thing, the Zoku micro apartment, came out of a design competition. They went to a number of designers and said, right, this is the square footage or square metres you've got to work in. Come up with a solution that you think people could actually inhabit and live long term. And, they came up having seen all the sort of entrants to that, working with the guys. It's been fascinating to see some of the applications there and how people have applied it. And you learn from that, and you evolve from that, and it innovates, and it's great. And you can use it elsewhere as well, because even in your sort of bigger homes, you can actually have areas of the home which you need to be more efficient. Why not, if you can import that?
Great. Okay. Well, we've reached 4 o'clock now, so it's probably about time for me to round up. It's been a very interesting discussion there. So lots of opportunities, but also challenges to the introduction micro apartments. It'd be interesting to see what happens. So if you could just thank Yolanda and Chris in the usual way. That's great. Thank you very much.